So if we could start off by talking about health and safety as a general topic, what would you say as a first question, really? What would you say health and safety means to you?
Well, obviously, since the last sort of 13 years I've been speaking, health and safety means absolutely everything to me. Prior to that, what did it mean to me? Probably what a lot of people I speak to when they come into a session mean, because it hasn't got the best reputation of being an interesting topic, especially to a room full of people sat in a canteen or in a venue. We feel like we've got better things they could be doing with that hour of time. Arms folded. When they come in a room, we still experience that sort of thing. I think making health and safety be more attractive to listen to is key. The days of just reading off a flip chart and telling people what they should do, I think is gone. We need to involve people and ask them what they think about health and safety. I think that is key, involvement. Are we talking to or talking with the people we want to help? However, I actually believe we've changed, and I think we've changed probably due to the crisis we've all been through. And I think now we are taking this holistic approach to well-being as well. It should be health, safety, and well-being. Traditionally, it's always been about rules and procedures and getting them right, and then the training. And obviously, if people are trained and people have the right equipment, they should work safe. But we all know that people sometimes choose not to, which was in my case of my accident. I actually chose not to work unsafe, and probably that's where we are.
Well, it is interesting you bring that up, because I was gonna ask you a question about that later on. I think there's definitely been a shift, hasn't there, between the mental health aspect and the inclusion of that. It's health, safety, and well-being, as you rightly said. And I think in that answer you just gave there, you really did sum it up. There's this kind of stigma, isn't there, regarding the topic of health and safety. My next question was always going to be, you have your view on it, we have our view on it, and I think it's pretty shared. Do you think other people share that view?
Some, if I'm being totally honest, I still get asked to speak for certain clients where they see my presentation as a tick in a box. Oh, we'll get an inspirational speaker and that'll solve our problems, or we've signed the sheets, tick the box. And I'd like to say that doesn't happen today, but it still does occasionally. I mean, I'm very fortunate now, got quite a good reputation, so I don't really get asked to be in the presentation anymore. But in the early days, I spent a lot of time just going in rooms with guys, signing the sheet, no introduction, just go in the room, and there wasn't really interested in even what I'd said. So that's a shift. Yeah, I think there has been a shift, a positive shift. I think people are slowly realising that the old format, and it might have achieved a certain amount. It might have achieved a little bit, but for how long? It wasn't long lasting. Hence why historically a lot of companies go on the yearly campaigns. I always roll my eyes slightly when I get approached by a company saying, "Well, we've got a campaign going of working at height," and I sort of roll my eyes and say, "What is it?" I said, "Well, why are you having a campaign? What is the longevity of the campaign? Because it'll start off really well, and then it'll get towards the middle, you have a little bit of a dip, and then it falls away at the end. And then they wonder why a year later they're asking me back to do another campaign."
And it should be something that should be just company-wide, yes, year on year, every day.
It's a continuum of always striving to get better. Never sat, we're always looking for the next thing to help. And me personally, I don't think there's any one training that's the key. And for so long, I think a lot of companies have been looking for the golden bullet, or whatever they like to call it, and there isn't one. It's just a mix of online training, face-to-face, equipment, assessment. It's just ongoing. And without sort of going into next questions, I know what some of the questions going to be asking. We'll probably answer that a bit deeper as we go through the podcast.
Well, it was very, very interesting, because I think we have that kind of combination, don't we? Where in corporate life, there are companies that will take it for what it is, and they'll try and push it. And there is this, we'll talk later on about this report that we published, but there is this compliance issue. There is this, tick boxing issue, and sometimes it's very, very hard to see what the difference is, because obviously, you know, it's all PR. In your opinion, with the culture of health and safety, um, you know, how is the status of that today, say, maybe in comparison to 10 years ago, when I know that you were still traveling the world and doing what you are doing now?
Yeah, obviously, if we look back 10 years, have things improved? Of course, they've improved. Has the culture improved? I think there's definitely been a shift from safety culture to looking at just culture of the business. I
Right.
think that's probably the biggest shift that you know we've seen. We've still a long way to go, and obviously that's what we try and specialise in, getting companies away from just talking about having a great safety culture, because that doesn't really talk about the culture of the business. You know, what is the culture of the business? What is what is the attitude of your people when they turn up for work in the morning? Are they coming in a good mood because they're working for a good company with a good culture? Or they're working for a company that's got a good safety record, but actually is not very nice to work for?
Right. And well, ultimately, this was going to be my next question, because interestingly, we've released a report, as I just previously mentioned, on really asking our partners, you know, our corporate learners, about their perception of health and safety in their business. And I've got the figure here. I think it was 61% viewed that the changing of culture and behavior in business regarding health and safety is their biggest aim. Now, the interesting thing there with me with that is, would you say that when you go company to company, would you say that that is the one thing that you take away that's most obvious in those companies? That it is the changing of behaviors, the changing cultures that's required?
Yeah, yes. I say it in that way. Yeah, yeah, yes, of course it is. Um, but I think people are still looking for this thing that's going to be the one thing to change it. You
Right.
know, it's not it's not a thing. The culture is something that it comes from the top, and it takes a while to build, and people have to trust it. You know, if people don't trust what's being said to them, you can have a company with the low KPIs, and they think they're doing really really well, but is that a reflection of the culture of the business? It might just be a case of they've been looking, had no accidents, but actually it's a real crap place to work. Um, so yeah, I totally agree with that. But changing the culture and the behaviours, it is very challenging. It is very very challenging to get to that point. And I paraphrase Tim all the time. Obviously, Tim Marsh, my business partner, and some things he says. It, it takes so long to build a really, really good culture in the company, and yet it only takes one incident to break it and bring it back down to zero again.
That's actually a very, very interesting quote, because ultimately you've been talking here about this magic bullet, this kind of this kind of thing that would fix everything, this magic pill. Um, would that be cutting corners, do you think? Do you think it takes more than that? Do you think it takes more than, you know, a seminar? You know, what is your opinion on the fact that these companies are you know, bringing you along, and people are, you know, like you, and are trying to use you as that kind of, as that motivating factor? Do you think it requires more than that? Is there, you know, is that cutting corners?
Uh, um, Again, I'm going to answer in two ways. Cutting corners, yeah, yeah. I mean, some companies have traditionally used me for that. They've seen me at a conference. Oh, come speak to our guys. We need you in straight away. And I do a series of road shows. I go all over the country, Europe, wherever it was, to all the facilities. And they truly believe that would be the answer, and there'd be no follow up. I suppose me 10 years ago, I probably brought into that a little bit. I thought I could really help on this, and again, joining forces with Tim, sort of realising that I think what an inspirational speaker does, and I know at the moment at time the inspirational speaking people are a bit been like, I know we don't have the same impact, but we've always had the same impact. An inspirational speaker will do something in the room that probably no one else can do. They create that moment.
Yeah, right.
But if a company then does nothing with that moment, even the greatest speaker on the most heartbreaking story, that story is only lasts for a period of time. Now, some people, it may change them forever. You know, some people may be so affected by what you've said, they might change immediately. There may be a few people in the room who pay no attention to that presentation at all, and I've come across these people. But for the vast majority of people, I think we create a moment, and that moment can last for a week, in some people 2 weeks, a month, even a year. But eventually, that moment will fade. It's like watching your favourite film. Over a period of time, it pops out your mind, and it always takes a trigger to bring that memory back. So, you know, I'm a true believer that company has to do more than just bring it. It's what you do next. I've always said it's what you do next, and that applies to anything. Whatever you do is only good for that moment. It's what you do next, and what are you going to do continually to create this culture where, you know, it gets better and better and better. I think that's all we can aim for. You know, I had a great speech. I was working this week, and Louise Ward, really, really well regarded, and you know, she made a statement to the workers. She says safety is not a number one priority, and you can see people in the room thinking, what she means. She says, but we will always strive to be the best we can possibly be.
Right.
I think that was a really, really powerful quote, because you know, I go to many conferences, and you know, the CEO always standing on stage saying safety is our number one priority, and yet nobody in the room believes it. I think that is the thing with culture. We have to believe what's being said to us, and if we don't believe it, it just sends people backwards.
Well, I think there is that idea, isn't it, that it will happen to, you know, 1 in 100. It will never happen to me. But out of curiosity, an impromptu question is, when you're confronted with those people, say in the front row, who aren't paying attention, how does that make you feel?
Yeah, I normally find people aren't paying attention, I always sit at the back anyway. So
Right.
after years of doing presentations, I gauge people as they walk in the room and where they sit. You know, I already sort of made my mind up, and it's not always that people aren't interested in safety. They just probably don't want to listen to a terrible story, because they may be going through their own problems at the time, and you know, the last thing they need to hear is more doom and gloom. So when I very first started, obviously I was very, very raw. You know, it was such a traumatic time for me to share my story. I was reliving it every day, and it was very difficult. And then when I ever got any sort of confrontation in the room or someone at nothing, I take it really, really personally.
Right.
You know, but today, like I say, I don't judge anybody in the room now, because we don't actually know what's going on in their life, and I think it's getting away from people don't want to listen to the story more, that there must be a reason why they don't want to listen to that story in that moment. So talking about the well-being, which we'll come on to, is I now engage people who don't want to listen. Maybe they're going through some personal trauma at the moment. Maybe this is just a bad place for them to be. So I always give people the authority to walk out of the room. You know, if you're not in a great place, or I say anything that may offend you, or you don't particularly want to listen to today, please feel free to walk out the room. And you give people, I think it's breaking down these presentations, because people just presume that's what it's going to be about. So I'm going to talk to you all about this horrendous experience. And I think any training should be like that. You know, we have to engage people to want to listen to the presentation, even if they particularly don't want to listen to it.
Well, I think that's very, very true, because in doing research for having you on the show today, I've listened to you know, I think you would call it what, cyber stalking. I've been watching all of your talks and all of your presentations, Jason, and some of them can be really emotional and very, very hard to get through right from the beginning right to the end, because you are probably the most honest and brutally down to earth health and safety speaker I've ever come across. So I can understand that. My next topic would have really have been about, you know, your company work, and how you go across the world and you discuss health and safety topics to workforces. Obviously, we've had the COVID-19 pandemic, and for me personally, I've seen a huge positive shift in attitudes towards health and safety since it's happened. How do you feel about that, Stephen? Because you're going to these companies and you're gauging a more first kind of hand experience.
Yeah. Well, obviously when it hit the first time, you know, obviously the face-to-face work just completely dried up. But obviously, I was getting approached by companies who was going through a really bad time. Morale had dropped massively. So you had people who was furloughed, but then you had people who were still going to work. But they was going to families, so they had double stress of a job. The job wasn't the same. People, less people at work. People, being furloughed, and so there was definitely a shift in. I think everybody was affected by the pandemic, whether they stayed at home, whether they got furloughed, whether they're still working as a key worker. And I think what we was talking about for the couple of years prior to the pandemic was, I hate that word, but that's what it's called. We was always sort of going down this road of trying to tie well-being to health and safety. And me in particular, with my presentation, I was sort of advised by quite a few people not to do it. That what you're speaking about well-being for is part health and safety. And if anything, the pandemic actually gave me the opportunity to speak about it a lot more. So on all my online presentations, obviously we shifted straight away to online. We did quite well. It was quite busy through the pandemic, actually. A lot of time I was reaching out, helping clients. I spent a lot of time with emails on the phone to good clients of mine, asking, do you need any help? Some clients who took me up on an offer to do some free presentations just to try and engage with the staff who were still working. But there's been a definite shift. I'm a big believer, no matter how bad things are, you try and look for the small amount of positive was in there, because in any tragedy that happens, however small it is, there's always a piece of positivity. We have to sort of focus on that part, and that's how I sort of live my life today. And so that's what we did as a business. Now, what can we shift? So even now we're back doing face-to-face stuff, which is which I love doing the best. I'm still doing quite a lot of virtual stuff as well, because for some clients it really, really works. They've got a workforce that's split in different places, so for some clients it really, really works. But for me, it's been a really traumatic time for the majority of people in one way or another. Some people have lost family members, some people have lost their jobs. It's been traumatic for everybody. And as we slowly come out of this on the other side, I think people actually realise that our biggest fear was that when people came back into the workplace, they wouldn't be switched on. It's like, I always use the analogy, it's like a footballer who's broke his leg. He's been on the sidelines for a bit, then he goes back into training,
Right.
leg work, all the work, but he doesn't go and play a full game of football. There's a period of time that gets him back up to fitness.
Okay.
What's happened with the pandemic is people have been off for whatever reason, and then you're straight back to work, pressing buttons like you've never been away. For some people, it could be 2 years. So is there going to be a spike in accidents? That was my biggest fear, but we're going to hit something. We've made so much progress over the last decade. Now people are back in the workplace, back on sites, back on construction sites, probably doing things they're not, you haven't got the mental muscle to quite remember how to do this job. I mean, a colleague of mine, Matt Hazelton, who does a lot of speaking for us, he's a great, he does presentations of his tragic accident that killed 2 of his family members and 2 friends. He's actually got his own groundworking company, and he just said that he got into a digger one day, and for a split second, he just started thinking, where's everything go? It wasn't. It was having to think about what he was doing. It wasn't that memory muscle of just working a digger like he normally would. And I think that just demonstrates that people just need this time to reaccustom. And I'm sure deadlines on projects aren't going to give any leeway for how people are feeling at the moment. Deadline is a deadline, and that's it. So are people going to be pushed to get deadlines met when they're not physically, mentally fit at this moment in time, just to hit the high peaks of production?
It's that adjustment period, isn't it? It's that adjustment period after being at home for, I can't even remember how long we were at home now for. It seemed like forever. But I can imagine, I hadn't even thought about the implications of that kind of cooling off period for construction site workers. That must be, yes, that must be horrendous. But on that topic, for the corporates now, so when you're being invited since the pandemic to kind of give these talks, give these seminars, do you feel more urgency in their requests because of the scrutiny health and safety has been under since the pandemic, and how however politically you're aligned, there have been definitely some insinuations that health and safety could have been improved, and therefore since then there has been this general consensus that health and safety needs improvement.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what I'm hearing from the people who contact me, the clients, is they're terrified. They're terrified something bad is going to happen, but they feel that even the workers they've used for years and the subcontractors they've used for years, they feel like things are feeling slightly different. There's a lot of big added pressures to a lot of to everybody. Not just the pandemic. Now we've got the rising cost of raw materials, pressures on deadlines. There seems to be a lot more weight put onto companies. That's not just about safety. It's just the morale. Even go as far as that, the morale of their staff. So a lot of companies are pretty scared at the moment. Hence why I'm really busy at the moment, going to places just try and get people back on track to where we were pre-pandemic, because we was doing pretty well. And I think all the stats would support that. And I saw there's been another fatality in Forth and Mike this week up in Scotland. You just feel so heartfelt for the families going through something. Someone's fell from height, an accident similar to mine, but tried being killed. And then I feel that enormity. Imagine that family going through all those things that my family went through, and the friends. And it's absolutely tragic. And that has always been the fear of this pandemic. Is it going to take something serious, really serious to happen? Is it going to take a real major accident to happen to reset where people are? Or we're just going to bumble forward, hoping for the best, that it's not going to happen?